Hi, I'm Ava Hu.
And I'm Robert Chiretta, and this is International Investor.
Robert, in this program, we will be discussing the largest infrastructure project the world has ever seen.
Yes, the Belt and Road Initiative,
which is also sometimes called the Silk Road because it follows the same trade pattern that brought refined goods and products from the Far East to Europe and beyond.
Yes, and made famous in the West by Marco Polo, of course, who wrote extensively about his travels.
But there are many Chinese traders as well. However, they may not be as well known in European circles. Centuries before Marco Polo, there was another famous traveler called Zhang Qian, who also traveled the Silk Road, but the West doesn't celebrate him.
Lesson learned. Good for you. But back to our modern Silk Road, what impressed me most, Ava, about this concept was its enormous size and scale.
You can see that again, Robert. As you can see on this map, it is extensive. According to President Xi, the total length of it is 9,000 kilometers.
To finance a project of this size will take great sums of capital. By one estimate, if the entire project was realized, it could cost as much as $26 trillion.
Well, Robert, the Chinese government has already committed $1 trillion to start the project. But the reality is that it's not just one single Silk Road, but rather a series of railroad and highway projects meant to facilitate and speed trade throughout the region.
I see from the map that we are talking about an intersection with many different countries as well, aren't we?
Well, from the Chinese point of view, there are actually two belts or roads. One is called the Silk Road Economic Belt, and the other is called the 21st Century Maritime Road. It is called maritime because it goes through the Indian Ocean and Malaysia and Singapore Straits and goes back to the South China Sea.
Well, let's take this one step at a time to show our audience how this enormous project originates in China but extends into two other continents as well.
It's clear that China will have the money and means to complete the project within its borders.
I'm certain you're right. They've already demonstrated to the world with their high-speed train network that they are quite capable of constructing the most sophisticated infrastructure in a very short period of time.
But Robert, this project is even bigger and longer than the famous Great Wall.
Well, to further discuss the broad scope of this project, you and I attended a Silk Road Summit, which was organized and held within the halls of the United States Senate.
Yes, at that event, we heard from representatives from the Chinese Embassy, other nations on Silk Road, and leaders in infrastructure. We also got a chance to interview one of those representing the organization which hosted the event, the Eurasia Center. Let's go there now.
And I'm now with Ralph E. Winnie Jr. Ralph, thanks for being with us. You're a partner, I know, at Henson, Pang & Winnie, an international law firm and consulting group with offices here in Washington, D.C., in the United States, and of course Shanghai. For full disclosure, you are employed by one of the districts in China that helps to promote trade and better business relations.
Well, I've been a
United
business
States.
Development rep for Guangxi.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm so glad you're with us now because you're the China guy at the Eurasia Center. And of course, we're always watching developments there. This show is dedicated to the Silk Road, or as it's also known, the Belt and Road Initiative.
Right.
Something extraordinary that China has conceived. Of course, it was known historically. I mean, first of all, what strikes me is the tremendous size and scope of the project.
Well, if you think about it, think about Marco Polo and what he did in terms of going from Italy all the way through the Silk Road into China.
Right.
And it encompasses all of these countries, these former Soviet bloc republics, you know, Asia, China, Russia, Korea, Burma, Thailand, India. I mean, it's just incredible what the Chinese want to do in terms of linking East versus West and bring the ability to promote not only business-to-business relationships, but people-to-people exchanges and relationship building, which is so important because the business is number one, but the personal relationships flow from the business side of things.
Well, I want to talk about China's motivations in just a
Right.
second. But before I do, let's talk a little bit about what the impact could be for some of these regions who have not recently been part of the global market, if you will. The stand states, the Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and others, and even Eastern Europe.
Well, they're all looking to move away from the orbit of the Russian influence, and they're looking to promote trade and investment opportunities within their own countries. And the way they do that is they need to market themselves and have the ability to promote infrastructure, port development that will allow people to have access to these particular countries, which have been isolated and landlocked for many, many years.
That's right. And yet, this is a classic example of soft power, isn't it, though? I mean, here China is saying to themselves, look, we've built up wealth, trillions of dollars
Sure.
in reserves from all the trade we've been doing. Now let's start to use it to reach out to our neighboring states, even far beyond, and to use it, let's face it, in a way that could very likely be for their benefit as well as other countries. Some have said that they're using it to manipulate a lot of other countries. How do you respond to that?
Look, I think the Chinese are on the right track. They are trying to grow their own economy and to promote jobs and economic development opportunities for their businesses. And the way they do that is to create opportunities for their people to go overseas and to make money. And at the same time, create a positive working relationship between China and these other countries to show that China is not a bully, that they are there to promote job creation, economic development, infrastructure, and port development. So it's a key for the Chinese to promote their own image, which has been tarnished because of the issues that have happened in Africa.
That's right. And even in some of the stand states, and you're right, Sri Lanka, look, they've come in, they've given us a lot of money, but now they're using that indebtedness of ours
Exactly.
to coerce maybe some changes. Also, some of these countries have been saying, look, if you're going to come in, employ our people, or
Right.
train some of our people to become better managers or whatever it else it did. I think China's responding to that a bit, aren't they?
Right, and I mean the Chinese, traditionally what they've done is they brought in their own people. They just never thought anything of it. They didn't realize the negative implications it would have towards the relationship.
Resentment,
Right.
yeah.
So now they understand how important it is to work with the locals. And that is going to be the key moving forward, how they relate on that personal and professional level with the local establishments. Certainly the stands are important for the geopolitical reasons. Security is very, very important now. You know, that you have the rise of radical Islamic fundamentalism and terrorism in general. And a lot of these stand countries are faced with those same issues that China, Russia, and the US are.
Well, including the religious issues. You know,
Correct.
a lot of these are still Muslim states or partially
Exactly.
Muslim states. In light of China's, let's face it, recent ignoble history with the Uyghurs, they're probably somewhat suspicious of China's.
Well, that's why China invited leaders from these Muslim countries to come and tour the facilities where many of these Uyghurs are held in Xinjiang. And what was interesting is a lot of these Muslim leaders are not criticizing China.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So,
Because the Chinese are trying to do something to prevent the rise of radical Islamic fundamentalism. Whether you agree with it or not, the leaders from these Muslim countries have those same issues that are affecting their ability to grow their own economy.
Okay. Now
Yeah.
let me point to something though, both good and bad as far as
Right.
China is concerned. The corruption issue raises its head because
That's very, very important.
because some of the leadership of some of these countries, let's just say the average citizens might feel maybe my leadership's doing deals with China that may not be in our long-range best
Right.
interest. On the other hand, the other side of that coin is in some cases, some of the Chinese money has disappeared in a couple of the deals. And China was like, hey, it didn't end up in the infrastructure. Where did it go? And again, it was usually corruption.
Well, the Chinese are cracking down on their own institutions. I mean, the equivalent of KPMG in China was recently sanctioned by the
big
Chinese
accounting firm in
right,
China. Okay.
Right, because they are deeply concerned because the issue of corruption affects China's image internationally, and they don't want to have a negative image going forward. So they are cracking down on any issues involving transfer of money in and out of the country.
Yeah.
So that everything has to go through registered entities that are connected with the government.
Okay. But
so-
you can understand the
Yeah.
suspicion of people maybe not trusting their own leadership in making deals with China for some of this infrastructure.
Well, and a lot of these stands have had their own issues of corruption because
right. They always have.
right.
And
I mean,
their
there's
governments
no
has gotta come a
history or
long way.
tradition of capitalism.
Yeah.
So now they're kind of moving towards the goal of capitalism, but they need the mentorship, the guidance, the training, and they need to engage with successful business leaders and entrepreneurs. And they're looking at China because of their promotion of their equivalent of free market capitalism. I always say it's the People's Republic of Capitalism.
Okay. On that note, we're going to have to end it here because we got to get to those other guests that I mentioned. Ralph, thanks so much for finally joining us here at
It's a
International
pleasure to be
Investor.
with you,
Sure.
Bob.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
Great to see you.
All right. And that's all for now. But as I said, we're going back to our studio to talk further about this tremendous project known as the Silk Road. Interesting view on the potential and challenges of this enormous project and what it could mean for China.
Remember, at that conference, we also heard from a representative from the Chinese Embassy. Let's listen to him now.
For thousands of years, the Silk Road spirit of peace and cooperation, openness and inclusiveness, mutual learning and mutual benefit has been passed down through generations, promoting the progress of human civilization, and contributed greatly to the prosperity and development of the countries along the Silk Road, over land or across the sea. By rejuvenating the ancient Silk Road spirit, the Belt and Road Cooperation aims at providing new sources of growth for the world economy and creating new space for international economic cooperation and promoting global prosperity at large.
He sounded hopeful but cautious about the project. But now, let's trace this project even beyond China's borders.
The first stop is Kazakhstan. From the Kazakh side of the border, the railroad that is part of the Silk Road project stretches more than 8,000 kilometers to the west. Robert, did you know cargo can be shipped from a Chinese port via cargoes and reach Europe within 15 days, much faster than sea and cheaper than by air?
That is a significant savings. But moving over to Kyrgyzstan, there are 4 major road infrastructure projects that have been financed by China to the tune of $1.3 billion. But they are not all completed yet or connected, which tells me that this project still is a long way from completion.
In fact, this project, in theory, will not be finished until 2050. So there's still a long way to go.
What's our next stop, Ava?
Tajikistan. Currently, Tajikistan is building a major highway from its border with Kazakhstan to its border with Turkmenistan. China is currently the largest external creditor, extending over $1 billion.
Yes, in fact, at the Silk Road Summit, we also heard from the Uzbekistan ambassador. Let's go there now.
A number of strategically important projects of the development of transport infrastructure have already been implemented in the region. Great opportunities are also emerging with the development of the newly established Andijan-Ishketan-Kashgar automobile corridor that has been launched last year, and this newly established corridor between Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan and China will significantly facilitate transport and create favorable conditions for the regional economic growth.
He sounds very positive about the Silk Road and what it could mean for his nation. Tourist arrivals more than doubled in 2018, and foreign direct investment increased fourfold the first half of 2019.
Clearly, better transportation in his country will foster even more tourism.
And trade. The transit of goods will be essential to the economic progress of all these nations. This Silk Road project has the potential to connect all the stand states into the global economy.
Robert, that's true, because many of these nations are landlocked and have no access to the world's oceans. These projects give them the opportunity to bring their goods to seaports everywhere.
You're absolutely right. And our next stop, Turkmenistan, is the key which will enable all these nations to have access to the Middle East. The China, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Iran railway, completed in 2014, is regarded as part of the North-South Transport Corridor due to link with the Iranian railroad network running in a north-south direction.
This route is vital for Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan in accessing international waters. It connects Central Asia with Iran and, more importantly, Europe.
Compared to the China, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Iran line, the Chinese, Kazakh, Turkmen, Iranian line has a more affordable price for the transportation of goods. Because the railway passes through two countries rather than three, those who transport goods from Iran to China or vice versa tend to prefer this route.
By the end of 2017, the line was extended from Tauhundi to Herat, the principal city in northwestern Afghanistan. With the completion of the 100-kilometer railway, Herat will be connected to the Central Asia rail lines and have access to the Caspian Sea via Turkmenistan.
And then beyond Iran into Turkey, this Silk Road will finally find its way into Europe. Passing through other developing states such as Bulgaria and Romania, the Silk Road might eventually wind its way even up to the Ukraine and into Russia and back again to Poland, Germany, and Western Europe.
And its final destination is Marco Polo's home country, Italy, which will be the turnaround point from which the maritime road brings trade back, potentially through the Horn of Africa into the Indian Ocean. So Europe might benefit from this as well.
Particularly Eastern Europe. You know, the Slavic nation population is declining because of its poor economy and outward emigration.
So they really need some outside stimulus.
Correct. And the same is true with several other neighbors, including Romania, Eastern Germany, Hungary, where there has been a distinct slowdown.
So they really need an economic shot in the arm.
Indeed. And these massive infrastructure programs could do just that, employ thousands of people with high-paying jobs, stimulate production of various raw materials, and promote trade with all their neighbors.
But this will take money. Now let's talk about the financing of all this construction.
Well, it's complicated. In certain instances, China is taking the lead, supplying most of the capital, but in many cases, China is providing some seed money, then standing back to see if the host countries multilateral funding agencies or the private sector players and investors will join in.
Yes, in Tajikistan, for example, the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank are the two largest creditors behind China, with over $300 million and over $200 million respectively.
And in fact, China has been methodically building better trade and financial relationships with Europe for some time. Let's just look at their progress. China recently announced the formation of a special $11 billion fund, the China Central Eastern European Financial Corporation, they're calling it, led by the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, an enormous bank, with the purpose of developing infrastructure projects in Central and Eastern European countries.
But there are some downside risks associated with projects of this scale and investment.
Yes, in instances where China supplies most of the financing, they are greeted with open arms and given free rein to complete the projects on their own terms and according to their own time schedules. But where host countries are required to chip in, they have some demands of their own. They increasingly want a significant number of their own laborers and management to come from their own ranks rather than the Chinese.
Or that their Chinese engineers and managers train their corresponding host workers.
And there are increasing demands to use what raw and manufactured materials and equipment the host countries can provide.
Yes, even if they take longer to supply and turn out to be inferior to Chinese-made goods.
Much to the consternation of the Chinese, who press for deadlines and projects to come in at or under budget, which brings up another impediment to the Belt Road's completion. Corruption.
Right. In several instances, the Chinese money used to fund the project, which was forwarded to the host nations as part of the agreement, suddenly disappeared.
Yes, I am sure that China is quickly learning these lessons the hard way. Never advance cash without enforceable guarantees of performance. But you know, there are financial innovations in the West, such as performance bonds, specialized insurance contracts, and derivative instruments, which can protect the loaner by spreading the risk among many players in the institutional investment community. The Chinese will simply have to learn how to protect themselves with more sophisticated financial management techniques. But now, burned and embarrassed, they must refrain from allowing themselves to be so vulnerable and exposed again.
So, long range, what are your forecasts for the Belt and Road Initiative? Are you pessimistic?
You know, this bold and overly optimistic plan is fraught with difficulties and will face many obstacles and disappointments ahead. The likelihood of it being realized by 2050 is doubtful. But you know, the timeline doesn't really matter. Like the Suez Canal, the channel connecting France and England, even the European Union itself. Everyone thought these ideas were impossible, but eventually they happened because enough business, financial, and government interests began to realize the benefits that would be produced once they were completed. You know, in my view, the Chinese are to be commended for having the vision to dream up such a project. Despite all the difficulties, it will eventually be realized because each and every country will see the economic benefits of belonging sooner or later as their neighboring nations each tie into the Belt Road and prosper. You know, Ava, once upon a time, it was the United States that was the nation to dream of big projects. The Panama Canal in the 19-teens, New York subways, bridges, and impressive skyscrapers in the 20s and 30s. Our great interstate highway system built in the 1950s, and the space race to the moon won in the 1960s. But those days are gone. Now America's vast wealth is no longer spent on infrastructure, but rather consumed by the defense establishment each year over endless wars. We have spent $20 trillion in the last 2 decades fighting the bogeyman of terrorism. You know, there are still dreams and dreamers here in America to build such projects as our own high-speed rail network, similar to China's. How about bringing back supersonic air travel, which we once had, or to cure cancer, diabetes, and Alzheimer's? You know, just recently, there was a major advance to cure cystic fibrosis. It was announced, but it took 30 years for the laboratories to develop the actual drug because it was only supported, get this, by bake sales. How pathetic was it that our own government couldn't fund our NIH to do it maybe in 5 years? All those people lost in between. No, while we celebrate the invention of things like social media, pretending that their consequences are great when they are truly not, and gush over the speedy delivery of more consumer goods from Amazon, we now let other countries dream and launch programs that actually improve people's lives. In fact, in our next program, we're going to demonstrate how and why today's technologies are actually a step backward, and that the quality of life and what we call progress has either stalled or is actually reversing. One explanation for the lack of productivity gains in our economy today.
Interesting. I look forward to that program. But for now, we are running out of time. So I'm Ava Hu for International Investor.
And I'm Robert Sharetta. Goodbye, and keep your eyes open.